If you have one empty garden bed, and this is your first full garden, the biggest mistake may be trying to plant everything that sounds possible. 15 seed packets can look exciting, but your space, your weather, and your time are limited. So the real question is not what can grow in fall. The real question is which crops actually deserve a place in your first fall food garden. By the end of this video, we are going to cut a list of 15 crops down to the 5 to 7 I would prioritize first for a beginner. Some will earn points because they are easy, some because they are fast, some because they keep giving you food after the first harvest, and a few will lose points even though they are excellent crops, simply because they ask more from a beginner than the others. Before we touch a seed packet, there is one rule that matters more than the date on my calendar. Your local first frost date matters more than mine. A fall garden in Minnesota does not have the same runway as a fall garden in Virginia, Texas, or coastal California. So when I say plant now, think of that as an invitation to check your local conditions and work backward from the first expected frost in your area. A crop that fits comfortably into one region's fall may need to be started earlier, protected later, or skipped entirely in another. And there is a second rule. Do not judge a fall crop only by how quickly it reaches a harvestable stage. Fast is useful, especially for a beginner, because early success keeps you motivated. But fast does not automatically mean high yielding, and a big plant does not automatically mean a good use of limited space. A radish may give you a quick root and then be finished. A leafy green may keep giving you outer leaves over and over. A compact crop may fit into gaps that a larger plant cannot use. So throughout this garden, we are going to judge every crop by 4 questions. How easy is it? How fast does it reward you? How much useful food can it give you? And how much space does it ask for in return? That is our scoreboard. Easy, fast, yield, and space. It is not a scientific laboratory ranking, and it is not meant to pretend that every garden behaves the same way. It is a practical beginner filter. If 2 crops can both grow in fall, but one gives a first-time gardener a simpler path to a useful harvest, that matters. If another takes patience, but gives you a long harvest window, that matters too. Now, imagine the bed in front of you is completely empty. The soil is prepared, the surface is level, and all you have beside you is a watering can and 15 packets of seed. The first crop I would reach for is one of the simplest confidence builders in a fall garden, radishes. Radishes are valuable to beginners because they turn a blank patch of soil into visible progress quickly. You sow them directly where they will grow. You do not need a complicated transplanting routine, and the seedlings usually make it obvious that something is happening. That matters more than experienced gardeners sometimes admit. When this is your first season, seeing a row emerge is a little bit of proof that the garden is responding to you. But radishes also teach an important lesson. The root is the harvest, so steady growth matters. If the plants are crowded, stressed, or pushed through conditions they dislike, you may get plenty of leaves without the roots you expected. And if you sow a whole packet in one dense strip because you want more food, you can create competition instead of abundance. So give them enough room to form roots. Keep the top layer of soil from swinging wildly between bone dry and soaked. And think about succession rather than one massive sowing. Succession simply means you do not have to plant every radish on the same day. A smaller sowing now and another later, when conditions still allow it in your area, can stretch your harvest and reduce the chance that everything becomes ready at once. For a beginner, that makes radishes more useful than one giant batch. On our scoreboard, radishes score very high for speed and very high for beginner satisfaction. They are also space efficient because they do not need to become huge plants. But their yield story is different from a crop you can harvest repeatedly. Once you pull the root, that individual plant is done. Keep that in mind, because the next crop changes the equation. Leaf lettuce may not give you the same dramatic root reveal, but it can give you something radish cannot: harvest flexibility. Instead of waiting for one final moment, you can often begin by taking outer leaves, while allowing the center to continue growing. You can also grow lettuce relatively close together for baby leaf style harvests. Depending on the type, and the way you want to use it. For a first fall garden, this is a big psychological advantage. You do not have to choose between harvesting nothing and harvesting the whole plant. You can take a few leaves for a sandwich or salad, come back later, and take more. That makes a small patch feel productive, even when the total weight of any single harvest is not enormous. Lettuce also rewards good timing. It prefers cooler conditions than the heat-loving crops of summer. So late summer planting can be a transition period rather than a magic switch. If your soil is still baking and the afternoons are harsh, protecting newly sown areas from drying too quickly can matter. Shade from a temporary cover during the hottest part of the day. Careful watering, or simply adjusting your sowing window to local conditions can make establishment easier. The beginner mistake here is assuming that because lettuce likes cool weather, it cannot have trouble getting started while summer heat is still hanging on. The mature plant and the germinating seed do not experience the garden in exactly the same way. This is a theme we will come back to with spinach. On the scoreboard, leaf lettuce ranks very high for ease once it is established, high for useful yield in a small space, and very high for repeat harvest potential. Radish still has the advantage in the category of pure speed and simplicity, but lettuce is already challenging it on the question that matters more over a whole season. How many useful harvests can this patch give me? The third crop, arugula, is another strong early confidence builder, especially if you like its peppery flavor. Arugula can fit into small spaces. It can be harvested young, and it gives a beginner a leafy crop that feels very different from lettuce, even though both can occupy a similar part of the garden. Its strength is speed combined with culinary personality. A small amount changes a salad, a sandwich, a pizza, or a bowl of pasta. You do not always need a huge harvest for it to feel useful. That makes arugula a good example of why yield is not just a scale reading. 10 handfuls of something you actually use can be more valuable than a larger harvest that sits in the refrigerator. The mistake with arugula is treating it like a crop with no limits. As conditions warm, plants can race toward flowering, and the flavor can become stronger. In a fall garden, cooler weather often makes arugula easier to enjoy, but you still have to think about your local season. Sowings that are too early may deal with heat. Sowings that are too late may not have enough time to establish before severe cold arrives. So after 3 crops, radish leads on instant gratification, lettuce leads on harvest flexibility, and arugula gives us a fast, compact green with strong kitchen value. Already, you can see why planting all 15 without a plan makes less sense than choosing crops for specific jobs. Now we move into a group that looks perfect for fall on paper, but teaches beginners that cool season does not mean foolproof. First is spinach. Spinach is one of the crops people think of immediately when they hear fall garden, and for good reason. It is a cool season leafy green. It can be very productive when conditions suit it, and in many climates, it can become one of the most satisfying crops in a protected or extended fall season. But spinach is also where a lot of first fall gardens learn a frustrating lesson. The plant may love cool growing weather, yet germination can be disappointing when the soil is still hot. That means a beginner can sow spinach during a stretch of late summer heat, see poor emergence, and conclude that spinach is difficult. Sometimes, the crop is not the problem, the timing of establishment is. This is why I would never give someone across the entire United States one fixed date and say, sow spinach then. Your local temperatures, your first frost, and the amount of time you still have for establishment matter. If the soil is still very warm, you may need to wait for a better window, use a cooler spot, or take other steps that make the seedbed less hostile. Once spinach is growing, though, the story changes. You can harvest leaves rather than waiting for a single root or head. That gives it repeat harvest potential, especially if you take what you need and allow the center to continue. It is compact enough to earn real space efficiency, and its kitchen value is obvious. So spinach scores high for yield potential and space efficiency, but I would lower its beginner score slightly compared with leaf lettuce because timing the start can be less forgiving. This does not mean skip spinach. It means respect the part of the crop that is actually difficult. Next is kale, and kale changes the feeling of the garden because it is no longer just a quick patch of leaves. A kale plant can become a longer-term producer. You can harvest outer leaves, leave the growing point intact, and return again. In climates where the plant remains healthy through the cooler season, that can turn one plant into many meals. Kale also brings structure. A row of radishes may disappear when you harvest it, but kale remains in the bed. That can be a benefit or a cost depending on your space. If you have one small raised bed, a mature kale plant occupies more room than a strip of baby greens. So the question is not just whether kale produces a lot, the question is whether you want a crop that holds its territory for a long time. For beginners, kale is attractive because once it is established, harvesting is intuitive. Take healthy outer leaves, avoid stripping the plant bare, and let the center keep working. But like other brassicas, kale can attract pests, and young plants can be more vulnerable than the confident, mature leaves people picture when they think of kale. That gives us another useful beginner rule. The crop you see in a perfect harvest photo is not the crop you are managing in the first 2 weeks. Seedlings are smaller, tenderer, and easier for pests or weather to damage. Protecting a young plant can matter more than any fertilizer trick later. On the scoreboard, kale scores very high for repeated harvest and long-term usefulness. High for beginner value once established, but only moderate for space efficiency if your bed is tiny. It can absolutely earn a place in a first fall garden, but I would not fill half the bed with it. Swiss chard is the next leafy crop, and it often surprises beginners because it does not fit neatly into the same cool weather box as spinach. Chard is a beet relative grown for its leaves and stalks, and it can tolerate a broader range of conditions than some classic cool season greens. That makes it useful during the transition from late summer into fall. The leaves become large, and a healthy plant can keep producing as you harvest from the outside. That gives Swiss chard a strong yield score. It also brings a different texture and color to the kitchen compared with lettuce or arugula, but chard asks for room. This is not a crop I would pack as tightly as baby lettuce if the goal is full-sized leaves. In a small bed, a few plants can be more useful than a crowded block. Think of chard as a productive anchor crop rather than a filler. The beginner mistake is expecting a big, repeated harvest while planting too many plants too close together. More seedlings do not always equal more usable food. Sometimes, fewer plants with enough light, airflow, root space, and access to moisture give you the better harvest over time. At this point, our ranking is getting more interesting. Radish is still difficult to beat for speed. Lettuce remains one of the easiest flexible harvest crops. Spinach has huge fall value, but demands more respect at germination. Kale is a long-term producer. Swiss chard can deliver big repeat harvests, but asks for a larger footprint. And now we come to 4 crops that can completely change the way a beginner thinks about fall greens. Mustard greens, bok choy, tatsoi, and mizuna. Mustard greens are bold in both flavor and growth. If you enjoy that peppery, spicy edge, they can give you a leafy harvest that feels substantial without needing to form a root or a head first. Depending on the type and how you harvest, you can take younger leaves or allow plants to become larger. Their biggest beginner advantage is that they make the garden feel productive. Broad leaves create visible mass. That is satisfying, but do not confuse visual size with immunity from problems. Mustard is a brassica, and brassica pests can discover it. If you see small holes appearing quickly in young leaves, do not wait until the crop is skeletonized before investigating. This is where a simple habit becomes more valuable than an expensive product. Inspect the underside of leaves, look closely at new damage, and act while the problem is small. A beginner who checks the bed often will usually learn more than a beginner who reacts only after the crop looks terrible. Mustard greens score high for leafy yield and high for speed under suitable fall conditions. They lose a little universal appeal because the flavor is strong. A crop you do not enjoy eating is never high yielding for you, no matter how vigorously it grows. Bok choy gives us a different architecture. Instead of loose leaves only, it creates a compact cluster with thick, crisp stalks and green leaves. That makes the harvest feel substantial, and smaller types can fit well into a raised bed. Bok choy is also a good crop for explaining the difference between harvest style and yield. You can grow it toward a whole head style harvest, or, depending on the variety and your goals, harvest at a smaller stage. But if you cut the entire plant at the base, that planting is largely finished. So even though one harvest can feel generous, it is not the same production pattern as kale or chard, where you may keep returning for outer leaves. The beginner challenge is giving bok choy enough room to form well, while also protecting it from the same general group of pests that enjoy other brassicas. Good spacing, regular observation, and avoiding long periods of stress all matter. On our scoreboard, bok choy scores high for compact usefulness, high for kitchen value, and high for beginner satisfaction because the harvest looks and feels like a real crop. It is not always the repeat harvest champion, but it can be one of the best examples of a crop that earns its space through density and quality. Tatsoi is closely related in spirit, but visually different. It forms a low rosette, almost like a green wheel lying close to the soil. That low growth habit makes it attractive in a small space garden because it can create a lot of leaf surface without becoming tall. For a beginner, tatsoi is useful because it expands your fall garden beyond the same 3 supermarket greens. The leaves are tender when young, useful in salads or the same cooked dishes, and the plant can be harvested in different ways depending on size and preference. Its low habit also teaches another practical lesson. Crops close to the soil can collect splashed soil and debris more easily. Watering at soil level, mulching where appropriate, and harvesting cleanly all make the final kitchen job easier. Tatsoi scores well for space efficiency and cool season value. It may not be as familiar to every household as lettuce or kale, so its real yield depends on whether you will use it. That sounds obvious, but it is one of the most important rules in edible gardening. Grow food that fits your kitchen, not just food that looks impressive in the bed. Mizuna rounds out this group, and it brings a different texture. The leaves are deeply cut and feathery. The growth can be loose and abundant, and it can be harvested young or allowed to create a fuller clump. Mizuna can be valuable in a first fall garden because it gives you another cut leaf option without demanding the same space as a large kale plant. It works in salads, stir-fries, and mixed greens, and it can make a small patch look full quickly. But again, we need to separate harvest quantity from harvest usefulness. If your family loves mild mixed greens, mizuna can be excellent. If everyone in the house refuses to eat it, then that patch is wasted space, no matter how beautiful it is. So among the Asian greens, mustard is bold and productive, bok choy offers a compact, substantial harvest, tatsoi shines in low space-efficient rosettes, and mizuna gives you loose, repeated leaf potential. This is the point in the video where I want to change the question. The fastest crop in the garden is not automatically the highest yielding crop. The biggest plant is not automatically the best use of the bed. And the crop with the highest theoretical harvest is not the winner if you do not actually eat it. A more useful definition of high yield for a home garden is this: how much food that you actually want to use can this crop give you from the space, time, and attention it requires? That definition changes the ranking. Radishes are fast, but each root is a one-time harvest. Kale is slower to become a large plant, but it can keep giving leaves. Green onions may never look dramatic, but they can fit into narrow spaces that would otherwise be empty. Parsley may take patience at the beginning, yet once established, it can keep contributing to meals in small amounts for a long time. This is why I would never build a beginner garden by choosing only the crops with the shortest harvest times printed on the seed packets. You want a mix of fast wins and steady producers. Now, let us move underground again with turnips. Turnips are interesting because they can be a two-part crop. Many gardeners grow them for the root, but the greens can also be useful depending on the variety, condition, and how you like to cook. That gives turnips a different yield profile from carrots. They also fit the fall theme naturally because cool conditions can suit root development and leaf quality. But like radishes, turnips need room in the soil. If they are crowded, you may get lots of top growth and disappointing roots. For a beginner, thinning root crops can feel emotionally difficult. You see a healthy seedling and think, why would I pull this out? But leaving every seedling in place can create a whole row of plants fighting for the same small amount of room. Thinning is not wasting plants. It is choosing which plants get enough space to produce the crop you actually want. That lesson applies to carrots too, but turnips usually give you a larger, more obvious target. On the scoreboard, turnips score well for versatility and moderate to good space efficiency, especially if you use both roots and greens. They are not my first pick for someone who wants the absolute easiest leafy harvest, but they can be a very satisfying root crop. Green onions are almost the opposite. They are narrow, upright, and not visually dramatic, but their space efficiency can be excellent. You can fit them along edges, in small gaps, or in rows that do not dominate the bed. This is why green onions are one of my favorite examples of a crop that wins quietly. They may never become the thumbnail star, but they can give you something useful in the kitchen while asking for very little horizontal space. They also offer harvest flexibility. Depending on how you grow them, you can take young onions, use the green tops, or stagger harvests, rather than clearing the entire patch at once. That flexibility makes them especially practical in a first garden where you are still learning how much of each crop your household actually eats. The beginner mistake is treating them as an afterthought, and then planting them where they receive no light or where larger crops will completely shade them out. Efficient use of space does not mean forcing a crop into a bad location. It means using small pockets of suitable space intelligently. On our scoreboard, green onions rank very high for space efficiency, high for kitchen usefulness, and high for beginner friendliness. They are not the fastest visual transformation, but they are a strong candidate for the final group because they complement larger crops instead of competing with them. Carrots are next, and carrots may be the most satisfying harvest in this entire garden. Pulling a full root from soil is one of those moments that makes gardening feel magical. But carrots are also a perfect example of why satisfaction and beginner simplicity are not the same thing. Carrot seed is small. The seed bed needs attention. The surface cannot be allowed to dry repeatedly while the seed is trying to germinate. The developing roots benefit from loose, stone-free soil, especially if you want straight roots rather than twisted ones. And once the seedlings emerge, spacing matters. None of that means carrots are too difficult for beginners. It means they are a patience crop. They ask you to care about the first stage, even though the final harvest is hidden underground. If you are someone who wants visible feedback every few days, carrots can test you. You may see only fine green tops for a long time. You cannot look at the soil surface and know exactly how large every root is becoming. But if you enjoy the process and you have prepared the bed well, carrots can absolutely deserve space. For our ranking, carrots score high for satisfaction and kitchen value, moderate for beginner ease, and lower for quick payoff compared with radishes or arugula. They can be part of a first fall garden, but I would not rely on carrots as the crop that gives a nervous beginner their first win. Now we have two herbs left, cilantro and parsley. Cilantro is almost built for the seasonal transition because many gardeners struggle with it in heat. As temperatures cool, the plant can become much easier to manage compared with a midsummer sowing that bolts rapidly. For a beginner, cilantro has a huge advantage. The kitchen value is immediate. A small handful can change salsa, tacos, curry, rice, soup, or a salad. You do not need pounds of cilantro for the crop to feel worthwhile. But cilantro also has a reputation for disappearing just when you start to love it. The plant naturally moves toward flowering, especially under stress or warm conditions. So succession sowing can make more sense than expecting one planting to provide leaves forever. This gives cilantro a different kind of high yield. It is not about filling a basket. It is about repeated small harvests of a high-impact herb. If you cook with cilantro regularly, a modest patch can be extremely useful. On the scoreboard, cilantro ranks high for kitchen value, moderate to high for beginner ease in suitable cool conditions, and moderate for space efficiency because the plants do not need to become enormous. Its biggest weakness is that the harvest window can feel shorter than a long-lived leafy crop if you do not stagger sowings. Parsley is the patient herb. The challenge begins at germination, because parsley can take its time. That delay makes beginners wonder whether the seed failed. If you are used to radishes or arugula appearing quickly, parsley can make the same garden feel suddenly slow. But once parsley is established, the story improves. You can harvest outer stems and allow the center to continue growing, giving you repeated small kitchen harvests. Like cilantro, it does not have to fill a bowl to earn its space. A few sprigs can finish a dish. Parsley is therefore not a great choice if your only goal is fast satisfaction. It is a good choice if you want a dependable herb and you are willing to wait for establishment. Before we rank them, I want to slow down for a moment and talk about what these crops actually ask from a beginner. Because the seed packet can make every vegetable look equally simple. They are not equally simple, but the differences are manageable once you know where the difficulty lives. With radishes, the difficulty is not usually complicated care, it is restraint. Do not crowd them, do not bury them in rich, soft growth at the expense of roots, and do not forget that a root crop has to develop below the surface, even when the leaves look healthy. If the weather is still hot, the roots may become more pungent, or the plants may not behave the way you hoped. That does not mean radishes are a bad fall crop. It means the best fall gardens follow the weather instead of forcing the calendar. With lettuce, the difficulty is establishment and consistency. The seed is small. The roots begin close to the surface, and a new sowing can dry out quickly. Once the plants are growing, lettuce becomes much more forgiving, especially when you are harvesting leaves, rather than trying to produce perfect supermarket heads. That is why I like loose leaf types for beginners. They let you define success earlier. A handful of clean, tender leaves is already a harvest. Arugula is similar, but it teaches you to harvest according to taste. Young leaves are usually milder. Older leaves can become stronger. If you wait for an imaginary perfect size, you may miss the stage you enjoy most. Taste a leaf. Let your kitchen decide when the crop is ready. That is a much better rule than waiting for a photograph on a seed packet to appear in your bed. Spinach asks for patience with timing. If the seed bed is hot and dry, throwing more seed at the problem is not always the answer. Sometimes the smarter move is to improve the conditions or wait for a cooler window. This is one reason experienced gardeners can look patient while beginners feel like they are doing nothing. Waiting can be part of the method. Kale asks for protection at the vulnerable stage. A mature kale plant looks tough, but a seedling is still a seedling. Check for chewing damage early. If your area has heavy brassica pest pressure, physical barriers such as insect netting can be more useful than waiting for damage and then trying to rescue the plant. The exact pest will vary by region, but the habit is universal. Identify what is eating the plant before choosing a response. Swiss chard asks you to think long-term. A few healthy plants can become large. If you crowd them because the seedlings look tiny, you can create a jungle later. Give the crop enough room to become the thing you actually want to harvest. The same idea applies to kale and bok choy. Spacing is not wasted soil. It is future leaf area, airflow, and access to light. Mustard greens ask you to decide how much flavor you really want. If you enjoy mustard greens, a patch can become one of the most rewarding parts of the bed. If you are unsure, do not plant half the garden. Grow a smaller section, harvest young leaves, cook them in different ways, and learn whether they belong in your regular meals. This is a beginner strategy I wish more people used. Test your appetite before you scale your planting. Bok choy asks you to notice growth stage. A small bok choy harvested young is not a failed mature bok choy. It is a different harvest. That flexibility is valuable when your first frost is approaching or when pest pressure begins to increase. A beginner does not always need to push every plant to maximum size. Sometimes harvesting a beautiful, smaller crop is the smarter decision. Tatsoi asks you to pay attention to the soil surface because the plant grows low. Keep the bed reasonably clean. Water in a way that reduces unnecessary soil splash. And remember that dense rosettes can hide damaged or aging leaves near the bottom. A quick inspection when you harvest keeps the crop clean and catches problems early. Mizuna asks you to use the scissors intelligently. If you are harvesting it as a cut-and-come-again green, do not scalp the plant so low that you remove every active growing point. Take usable leaves while leaving enough healthy structure for recovery. The exact technique will vary with how the plant is growing, but the principle is simple. Repeated harvest only works when there is something left to regrow. Turnips ask you to accept thinning. The seed often produces more seedlings than the final spacing can support. If you leave them shoulder to shoulder because you hate pulling plants, you may end with smaller roots. Thin early enough that the remaining plants can use the room. And if the greens are clean and appropriate for the variety you are growing, thinning can sometimes become a small, edible harvest rather than pure waste. Green onions ask you to think vertically. Most gardeners picture the bed from above as a flat grid, but plants occupy space in 3 dimensions. A narrow upright crop can fit beside a broader crop if both still receive enough light and root room. This is how a small garden becomes more productive without becoming overcrowded. You are not squeezing plants together randomly. You are matching shapes. Carrots ask for the most faith. The root is hidden, the seed is small, and the early seedlings are delicate. This is why good seedbed preparation matters so much. Break up crusted soil. Remove large stones where practical. Keep the surface evenly moist during germination, and resist the urge to dig around constantly to see whether anything is happening below. Cilantro asks you to accept that some crops have a natural rhythm you cannot bully into stopping. When it begins moving toward flowering, you can harvest what you need, let some plants flower if you want to support pollinators or collect seed where appropriate, and have another sowing coming behind it. Succession is often more realistic than trying to force one cilantro plant to stay leafy forever. Parsley asks you not to confuse slow with dead. A seedbed that looks unchanged can still be viable. Keep your labeling clear so you do not accidentally dig up the row, and keep the surface conditions steady while you wait. Once the plants are established, the patience starts paying you back. Now there is another factor that changes every ranking: how you harvest. If you harvest a lettuce plant by cutting the entire crown, you have changed its yield pattern compared with someone who removes outer leaves. If you harvest baby bok choy, you have chosen speed over maximum size. If you let kale keep its central growing point, you have chosen repeated harvest over a one-time strip. If you pull every green onion at once, you have chosen a clean reset instead of a stretched harvest. Neither approach is automatically right or wrong. The right harvest style depends on your kitchen and your season. Imagine 2 beginners with the same 4-foot section of bed. One family eats a salad every night. The other family rarely eats raw greens but cooks soups and stir-fries several times a week. For the first family, leaf lettuce, arugula, mizuna, and maybe spinach could feel incredibly productive. For the second, bok choy, kale, Swiss chard, green onions, and turnips may deliver more useful food. That is why I do not want you to copy my final 5 to 7 crops as if they were a universal prescription. I want you to understand why they rank well, then adjust the group to your own kitchen. There is also the question of light. Fall changes light, even if the garden bed never moves. Days become shorter, the sun sits lower, and buildings or trees can cast longer shadows. A bed that received excellent summer sun may lose hours of direct light later in the season. Leafy crops generally give you more flexibility than fruiting summer crops in lower light situations, but growth still slows when light becomes limited. So, before you plant the full bed, watch it for a day. Where does the morning sun arrive? When does afternoon shade begin? Is the south side open, or is there a fence blocking low-angle light? You do not need a complicated instrument. A few observations can help you place the longer-term crops where they will receive the best available light. Water changes too. Cooler weather reduces evaporation, but that does not mean every seedling suddenly needs no attention. Newly germinating seeds live in the top layer of soil, which can dry surprisingly fast on a breezy day. Later, as roots deepen and temperatures fall, you may water less often. The garden's water demand is moving, not fixed. This is where people get into trouble with fall gardens because they keep the exact same watering schedule they used in July. In summer, that schedule may have been necessary. In fall, it may keep the soil wetter than needed, especially in a shaded bed. Instead of watering by habit, feel the soil and watch the plants. Pest management also becomes easier when you think in terms of prevention and observation. Brassicas such as kale, mustard, bok choy, tatsoi, mizuna, radishes, and turnips can share some pest problems because they are related. That means planting several of them does not necessarily diversify pest risk as much as it appears to. If one brassica begins showing chewing damage, inspect the others. Look under the leaves. Look near the growing point. Check the soil line. Do not spray first and identify later. A hole in a leaf is a symptom, not a diagnosis. And if you use a physical row cover or insect netting, remember that the barrier has to actually exclude the pest. A cover with gaps at the edges is a roof, not a barrier. Secure it well enough that insects cannot simply walk underneath. This is also why I prefer a mixed fall garden. If one crop struggles, another may thrive. If carrots are slow, radishes give you a root harvest first. If spinach germination disappoints, lettuce or arugula may still fill the leafy green role. If bok choy gets hit by pests, green onions and Swiss chard are not exactly the same target. Diversity is not just about having more things. It is about not depending on one thing. And that brings us back to the raised bed we started with. The goal is not to prove that you can fit 15 labels into the soil. The goal is to build a bed with different harvest rhythms. You want something fast. You want something you can cut repeatedly. You want something that uses narrow spaces. You may want a root crop for variety. And you may want one herb that earns its keep every time you cook. That combination is what makes the garden feel generous, even when it is small. And now we have seen all 15 crops. This is where most list videos end. They give you the last plant, tell you to subscribe, and leave you with the exact same problem you had at the beginning. Too many choices. So let us actually make the decision. First, easiest for a total beginner. Leaf lettuce belongs near the top because it is intuitive, flexible to harvest, and easy to understand. Radishes also belong here because they are direct sown, compact, and rewarding. Green onions deserve a place because they ask for little horizontal space and fit easily into a mixed bed. Kale can be beginner-friendly once established, but because it takes more room and can attract brassica pests, I would not call it the single easiest crop in every garden. Next, fastest satisfaction. Radishes are the obvious leader in this category. Arugula also scores very well because you can use young leaves and see the patch change quickly. Mustard greens can join them when conditions are right. Leaf lettuce is not far behind, especially if you are happy harvesting baby leaves rather than waiting for full heads. Now, best repeat harvest. This is where leaf lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, mizuna, parsley, and even green onions become more interesting. These crops can keep contributing after the first cut if you harvest them in a way that leaves healthy growing points or usable portions behind. Best use of small space is a different contest. Green onions are excellent because they use narrow strips efficiently. Leaf lettuce can be grown densely for baby leaves. Tatsoi offers a low, compact rosette. Radishes fit into short season spaces and can be succession sown. Mizuna can give a lot of leaf area without the footprint of a large kale plant. Then we have the patience picks. Carrots are worth growing, but they do not give the same early feedback as radishes. Parsley is useful, but germination can feel slow. Spinach can be excellent, but late summer soil conditions can make the start less forgiving. These are not bad beginner crops. They are crops I would add after you have included at least a few confidence builders. So if I had one empty raised bed, this was my first full garden, and I wanted a balanced mix instead of trying to grow all 15, here is the group I would prioritize. First, radishes for speed. They teach direct sowing, spacing, thinning, and the excitement of a root harvest without taking over the entire bed. Second, leaf lettuce for flexible repeated harvests. It gives a beginner something useful early and can keep giving if you harvest thoughtfully. Third, arugula for another fast leafy crop with a completely different flavor. It is compact, quick to feel productive, and useful in small amounts. Fourth, kale or Swiss chard. but probably not a large block of both if space is tight. Choose kale if you want a classic cool season brassica that can become a long-term producer. Choose Swiss chard if you want large, repeated leaves and a crop that can bridge a wider range of conditions. Fifth, bok choy or tatsoi. This gives the garden a compact Asian green with a different texture and harvest style. Bok choy gives you that satisfying, substantial cluster. Tatsoi gives you a low, space-efficient rosette. Sixth, green onions. They fill gaps, add kitchen value, and make better use of the bed without demanding the territory of a larger plant. And seventh, if you have room and the timing works in your climate, choose one patience crop based on what you actually eat. Spinach, carrots, cilantro, or parsley. Spinach, if you love leafy greens and can time establishment well. Carrots, if you want the satisfaction of a root crop and are willing to wait. Cilantro, if it is a staple in your cooking. Parsley, if you want a dependable herb and do not mind a slower start. Notice what we did not do. We did not declare 8 crops losers. Mustard greens, mizuna, turnips, and the others can all be excellent. We simply built a first garden around confidence, usefulness, and limited space. That is the biggest lesson in this entire video. A productive fall garden is not the one with the longest seed list. It is the one where every crop has a reason to be there. Before you plant, take one more look at your local first frost date. Then look at the seed packets for the specific varieties you are growing. Compare the expected time to harvest with the season you realistically have left. And remember that cool weather can slow growth even when the crop tolerates the cold. Give slower crops more runway. Use quicker crops to fill short windows. And if your fall is very short, prioritize crops that can be used young rather than crops that absolutely need a long season to reach full size. Then make a simple layout. Put the crops that hold space for a long time, like kale or Swiss chard, where they will not crowd everything else. Use rows or patches of lettuce, arugula, mustard, mizuna, or other greens where you can reach them easily for repeated cutting. Put radishes where they can be harvested and replaced. Use green onions along edges or between larger crops where the light is still adequate. Reserve a fine, carefully prepared strip for carrots, if you choose to grow them. And do not sow the entire garden in one afternoon just because you are excited. For crops that respond well to succession sowing, smaller batches can be more useful than one massive planting. That spreads harvests, reduces waste, and gives you a second chance if the first sowing meets a heat wave, heavy rain, pest pressure, or some other problem. Water the seed bed, not your expectations. Newly sown seeds need consistent moisture near the surface because their roots are tiny or not yet present. Established plants can often tolerate deeper cycles between watering better than a germinating seed can. This is one of the simplest reasons a beginner can lose a fall sowing. The weather feels cooler, so watering becomes less frequent, but the top half-inch of soil still dries faster than the seed can handle. Check the bed every day at first, not because you need to fuss with it, but because early observation is the fastest way to learn. Notice which row dries first. Notice where water runs instead of soaking in. Notice which leaves develop holes. Notice whether one corner stays shaded longer. Notice which crop your family actually reaches for when harvest begins. Those observations become your real garden calendar. The first year, you are learning the crops. The second year, you are learning your site. And after that, the garden becomes more predictable because you stop following generic advice blindly and start connecting it to your own soil, light, weather, and kitchen. If you remember only one thing from these 15 crops, remember this: you do not need the perfect fall garden. You need a useful one. A useful fall garden might be 5 crops, not 15. It might be one raised bed, not an entire backyard. It might give you a bowl of lettuce, a handful of arugula, a bunch of green onions, several radishes, and a few kale leaves each week, instead of one giant harvest. That still counts. In fact, for a beginner, that kind of steady, manageable harvest may be better than a garden that overwhelms you all at once. So take the pressure off. Check your frost date. Choose a few crops that fit the season you have left. Mix quick wins with repeat producers. Give root crops enough space. Give slow herbs enough patience. Watch the bed closely during establishment. And keep asking the question we started with. Does this crop merely grow in fall? Or does it actually deserve space in your first fall garden? When you choose with that question in mind, an empty bed stops being a blank space. It becomes a plan. And that is how a first fall food garden becomes productive before a single seed is even planted.